Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 310 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. The history of early America is vast and complex. It's a history that requires us to understand the people and events of at least 4 different continents across 4 different centuries. This is why we always have so much to discuss on Ben Franklin's World. The history of early America is really vast. Now, in order for us to understand the early American history of North America, we need to investigate and understand North America as an indigenous space. Native American populations, politics, religion, and trade networks prevailed throughout the North American continent for centuries before and centuries after the arrival of Europeans and enslaved Africans. So today, we're going to travel into the heart of the North American continent to explore the life, history, and culture of the Blackfeet people, one of the many indigenous peoples who lived in North America during the early American period and who still live in North America today. Historian, ethnobotanist, and award-winning Indigenous writer Rosalyn LaPier will serve as our guide for this exploration. Rosalyn is a professor of environmental studies at the University of Montana, and she's a member of the Blackfeet Tribe of Montana and a member of the Métis, one of the 3 recognized Aboriginal peoples in Canada. Now, as we investigate the history of the Blackfeet people, Rosalyn reveals the location of traditional Blackfeet homelands and information about how the Blackfeet lived on those lands in the early American period, Blackfeet environmental knowledge, and how the Blackfeet continued to transfer this tribal knowledge from one generation to the next, and details about the Blackfoot Confederacy and its diplomacy, and details about Blackfoot cosmology and religion. But first, thank you. Thank you for all of your help in supporting this podcast. I am truly grateful for all you do to tell your friends and family about this show. Your willingness to share Ben Franklin's World with others has helped this show find new listeners, which helps me and the Omohundro Institute with our shared commitment to make well-researched history available to all who want to know more about the early American past. Thank you for letting others know about Ben Franklin's World, and please keep up your great work in spreading the word about this show. Okay, are you ready to travel into the heart of the North American continent to explore the history and culture of the Blackfeet people? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Joining us is an award-winning Indigenous writer, ethnobotanist, and environmental historian. She's an associate professor of environmental studies at the University of Montana, and she works with and within Indigenous communities to revitalize traditional Indigenous ecological knowledge as a way to address environmental justice and climate change. Our guest is also an advocate for ways to strengthen public policy when it comes to Indigenous languages. And today, she joins us as a scholar and member of the Blackfeet Tribe of Montana, and as a member of the Métis, one of the 3 recognized Aboriginal peoples in Canada. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Rosalyn LaPier.
Well, thank you for inviting me to come and join the program and to share some of the research I'm doing and sharing some of the information I have learned from both my elders and also from the archives.
Well, we're really excited to have you too, and I know this is going to be a fun conversation. Now, we're interested in early American history, and one of our key interests in early American history is the different people who lived in North America roughly between 1450 and 1820. And as you know, Rosalyn, one of the peoples who lived in North America during that time period were the Blackfeet people, a group of Indigenous people who still live in North America today. So Rosalyn, could you tell us a bit about the Blackfeet people and their homelands during the early American or early modern period of North America?
Thank you for that question. So yes, the Blackfeet are a group indigenous to North America and exist and live in an area that is pretty much smack dab in the middle of North America. So if you took a map of North America and just looked right in the middle, that is where Blackfeet homelands are. And so the Blackfeet homelands traditionally were from what is now the Saskatchewan River in the middle of Alberta, south to the Yellowstone River in Montana, and from the Rocky Mountains all the way out to the middle of the prairies where the confluence of the Yellowstone River and the Missouri River, which is kind of near the border right now of Montana and North Dakota. So today, traditional Blackfeet homelands exist in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and what is now Montana. So we're one of the tribes that in contemporary society, we are split by the border. We're split by the Canadian border and the US border. So part of the Blackfeet Confederacy is in Canada, and there are 3 reserves in Canada where Blackfeet people reside. And then there's one reservation in the state of Montana. And so the historic groups of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which there were 4 historic groups, are now living on either a reserve or a reservation in Canada or Montana. So the Blackfeet as a group was actually, when you look on a map, you'll see sort of the historic territory, which will look like one giant round kind of space, again, between the Saskatchewan River down to the Yellowstone River. And oftentimes when you see a map, it'll just say Blackfeet, right? And it doesn't really explain the complexity of the people who lived there or the political structures of the people who lived there. So historically, there were between 4 and 5 tribes, which are sort of the larger political structures. Within those tribes, then there were individual villages, which anthropologists sometimes call bands, but a village of people. So each one of those tribes had between 20 and 25 villages of people. And those villages contained people who were related to each other, but often not times related to each other. So there would be several hundred people within kind of a village/band structure. So when you look at the 4 tribes of the Blackfeet and imagine, again, 20 to 25 village band groupings there was about 100 different villages and groups of people that made up the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfeet were semi-sedentary, which meant that they would live in the wintertime in a village, and they would stay there for about 6 months of the year. And all of these different villages, again, imagine there's about 100 of them, lived on different creeks and rivers on the northern Great Plains. They did not live out on the prairies the way we see in, common imagination and in paintings, kind of, a teepee out on a prairie. They actually lived by rivers and creeks. And so their village sites were almost always next to water. So they lived there during the wintertime and would prepare their year of subsistence hunting and gathering to prepare for that 6 months of staying in one place. They usually stayed in the same places almost every winter. So people knew where these village sites were because they were the common areas that people would return to year after year. Then in the summertime, they would travel and they would go to up to 15 different locations during the summertime. And these places were places that they went to year after year. And they would go to one place to go hunt. They'd go to the next place to gather. They'd go to another place to gather a different type of plant for plant foods, plant medicines, making their material objects, etc. And then they would stop for ceremonial activity. And then they would stop again for hunting. And when they did this, what is called a seasonal round, when they would go to these different places, again, they were going to places that they went to on a regular basis, usually an annual basis. So when you imagine, again, that there were 4 different groups that were part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, each of those 4 groups had about 20 to 25 village bands. And then each one of those villages was semi-sedentary, so lived in one place in the winter and then traveled to 15 different places in the summer. You can imagine now that this large area where the Blackfeet lived, there were about 1,500 village sites within that large area. And one of the things that then we need to reimagine when we look at the past and we look at this time period of early America, we need to think about how people were living within that landscape and using that landscape and populating that landscape. And oftentimes the stereotype of tribes that lived out on the northern Great Plains is that they were nomadic, not that they were sedentary or semi-sedentary. And even in their traveling, they were going to common places and they were camping in the same campsites and they were going to places that they already knew. So they were never actually sort of quote unquote being nomadic, following the bison, etc. They knew exactly where to go to hunt. They created landscapes that would be of benefit to animals. So using things like anthropogenic fire so that the next year, the grass was healthy and they knew that the bison would go there. So the common misnomer again of nomadicism, which we have read in the past within historical and anthropological writings, is really not true. And it's something that more and more scholars are addressing in new research and new writings. So again, when you think about the past and you think about early America, it is a place that is populated. It is a place where there's really no place on the landscape that Indigenous people haven't been, that they haven't lived, that they don't know the use of that area, that they don't have a relationship with that area. And so instead of having sort of, again, a image of a map, right, with the name of one tribe kind of plastered across the middle of it, you really do need to imagine thousands of village site areas, thousands of uses, and really a place that's alive with people and alive with human uses.
So we should definitely take away from our conversation that the Blackfeet in this early American period were semi-sedentary, that they had winter homes that they returned to 6 months every year, and that they traveled and lived off the land purposefully. They knew where the hunting grounds were, they knew where the bison would be, and they knew where the plants that they needed for food and medicine and other things would be, and that's why they revisited these places every year. Now, you also mentioned that the Blackfeet made and make their home in the northern Great Plains of North America. Would you describe this landscape of geography for us so that we can better picture it in our minds? Also, what were some of the traditions that the Blackfeet exercised when they were in their winter and summer homes?
So the northern Great Plains is a really interesting kind of large ecoregion in the center of North America. It is primarily mixed grass prairies. There are really no trees out on the prairies or the plains. There are trees by rivers and creeks. And so it really is a huge grassland area. So the people, the animals, and the plants that lived in this area evolved over time to really maximize kind of the uses of a place that is primarily a grasslands. It also is an area that's kind of arid to semi-arid. So oftentimes in the summertime, it can be quite hot and dry. The opposite is true in the winter. It can be actually quite cold and also dry. It is not an area that is humid like other parts of North America. And it can be an area that, because of its proximity to what is now Canada and the Arctic, that kind of the Arctic winds from the north blow down across the prairies. So it can also be a place that's quite windy. So one of the things that is important for both humans and also wildlife that lived on the northern Great Plains is access to water. So one of the things we do know, both from traditional knowledge that has been passed down by elders and then also, new research being done by archaeologists, is that the Indigenous people who did live on the northern Great Plains, they did live next to water. And as I mentioned before, the Blackfeet traditionally lived along creeks and rivers. And in the summertime, when they would travel to different locations for hunting or for plant gathering or for religious purposes, they always traveled from one water site to another. So either traveling from a river valley to a creek, to a spring, to another river valley, to a creek, to a spring. They knew, according to some scholars, every single spring, for example, that existed within their territory. So they knew always where to get water. One of the things that we know now from contemporary research done by archaeologists, for example, is that Indigenous people, of course, managed the landscapes that they were in or manipulated the landscapes that they were in. So, for example, there is new research being done in Canada looking at some of the river bottoms of places in Canada where they're looking at how there are areas on certain rivers where sort of an oasis of plant life exists. And so one of the theories is that as Indigenous people moved from kind of river area to creek area and back, that they would actually create those spaces so that it would work for them. They would transplant plants to certain areas. They would use anthropogenic fire so that the plant life was more plentiful. They would do, for example, not kill beavers so that beavers could create beaver ponds, which then create kind of a mini oases of plant life in a really arid area. And so the idea of not just sort of traveling from place to place, but then once you get there, kind of managing and manipulating that landscape so that it flourishes and it's a benefit to you, so that you know that next year when you go back to that place, there's going to be berries there, there's going to be wild roots that you can eat, there's going to be the wild medicines that you pick. So anyway, this is the kind of research that I think is really interesting, but it's something that more and more we're learning that Indigenous people did not just take the landscape as it came and sort of lived off the landscape, but they actually truly did sort of manage landscapes that they used to make them much more beneficial to not just to survive, but to really thrive in those areas.
The Blackfeet really had a profound knowledge of their environment and surroundings, and for how to make that environment work for their specific lifestyle. Do we know how their specific knowledge of the Great Plains environment developed over time?
We actually don't know that knowledge. We can speculate based on what we know today. I mean, today there is a method of transferring knowledge from generation to generation, of training people to learn that knowledge. So for example, myself, I'm a trained ethnobotanist. I was trained by my grandmother and my oldest aunt. And we did this in the method that the Blackfeet always have done, which is one, as a child, I just learned kind of the basics because my family goes out and gathers both food plants and medicine plants. My grandmother was well known on the Blackfeet reservation as, quote unquote, a doctor. So she provided a lot of services to our family and to the local community through plant medicines. So as children, we would go with her to gather plants. But the expectation when you're a child is kind of just that you watch and learn, but that was not a structured learning environment. It's not until you are older, and it wasn't until I was in my 20s, that my oldest aunt asked me to learn about Blackfeet plant knowledge. At that point, then I was in a different mode, which was I would meet with my grandmother and my aunt on a regular basis. I paid them, which is what we do in Blackfeet society. You pay the people that are transferring knowledge to you. It's very much like a university system, right? You go to university and you pay the university and you work with knowledgeable professors who then transfer their knowledge onto you. It's very similar to that process. So I worked with my grandmother and my oldest aunt over many years to learn about Blackfeet plant knowledge. And again, each time I met with them, I paid them. And then one day, my grandmother just sort of announced, now you're an old woman. And that was my graduation, right? I had just passed the test. I did not need to be in a formal kind of learning mode and paying them for their knowledge because I had sort of achieved that knowledge at that point. I'm now in that process of also working with young people to teach them as well. And again, this is not the kind of thing where, a person would go to one afternoon workshop on, ethnobotany and you'd learn a couple of things. To actually really learn about, the traditional ecological knowledge of a tribe, it really does take several years to do it. And there is a formal kind of educating process. The process that I experienced within my own family with my grandmother and my oldest aunt is very much the process that people used in the past in terms of passing down knowledge. So again, it wasn't sort of a haphazard process. It wasn't just people kind of learned vicariously. Oftentimes it really was a structured learning. Again, I compare it to university, very much like going to university to learn some of this information. The same is true with other types of information. People who learn about how to do certain types of creating objects or tools, people who participate in religion and learn about certain religious rituals, all of that is learned from somebody who is knowledgeable. And in the Blackfeet, we use the word transfer, that the knowledge is transferred to that person, but it's a actual structured process of working with somebody who is sort of the master and you're the apprentice. So that system has existed for a very long time.
Could you tell us more about ethnobotany and the work that ethnobotanists like yourself perform?
So historically, with the Blackfeet at least, different people had different specialties when it came to ethnobotanical knowledge. I would argue one specialty probably that everybody knew was about food and food plants. One of the things that we're, again, learning from contemporary scholarship and learning from archaeologists primarily is that oftentimes the majority of food that Indigenous people on the northern Great Plains ate was actually food plants. And the secondary food that they ate was meat and fat from meat. So it's interesting to see kind of the variety of food plants that Indigenous people ate in the past. But that was something that I would argue in the past was sort of common knowledge. Most people knew about the food plants, how they were gathered, processed, etc. Even though that knowledge was also gendered, which meant that women knew certain types of knowledge, men knew certain types of knowledge. And within ethnobotanical knowledge, you would know things like food plants that you ate, medicines that people collected and used, different types of plants that were used for object making or tool making, and different types of plants that were used for religious purposes and gathered specifically for religion and religious activity. And then also there were some primarily food plants, but also plants that were used for tool making that were gathered specifically to barter and to sell. So there was always sort of a surplus that tribes would have of their ethnobotanical materials that they used primarily just for trading and bartering.
Now, I'd like to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is that there were 4 tribes who belonged to the Blackfoot Confederacy. What was and is the Blackfoot Confederacy, and how has this confederacy helped support the Blackfeet way of life, both maybe in the present, but really in that early American period?
So I think one of the things we don't know about the Blackfoot Confederacy, of course, is how they became the Blackfeet Confederacy. And I think we don't know this with a lot of tribes in North America. Again, this is something that over time, some of this is becoming revealed primarily through archaeology and other types of scholarship. We do have, of course, oral tradition and what oral tradition says about the history of the Blackfeet, where they came from, and how they evolved to be who they are. You know, the Blackfeet and the Blackfoot Confederacy were, again, kind of 4 main tribes in the, central northern Great Plains area. And they really were, as has been said by other scholars, an empire. They commanded a huge portion of territory. So they were both a political entity that was run by several different political leaders. And there was a structure of political leadership. There was a structure of religious leadership and military leadership as well. And within those nations, it really was run like a nation state. And people knew what the boundaries to that nation state were. People knew what the rules were in terms of crossing those boundaries. And a lot of that information about how Indigenous tribes related to each other, related to the tribes around them, related to the Europeans who were arriving there in the 17th and 18th centuries. So they were very much like nation states of today.
That's a really interesting analogy to think of the Blackfeet Confederacy operating in the early American period in similar ways to how nation states operate even today, with different branches of leadership or government. And in the case of this early American Blackfeet Confederacy, you had three branches of leadership: religious leadership, military leadership, and political leadership. Now, as a scholar, you've written several books, including the award-winning book, Invisible Reality: Storytellers, Storytakers, and the Supernatural World of the Blackfeet. And you've also written 2 Blackfeet language lexicons or dictionaries. So I wonder if we could take a moment to talk about your different publications. In the case of your book, Invisible Reality, you note that you see the Blackfeet people's relationship with the supernatural or spiritual world as a necessary component of Blackfeet history. Could you tell us about the supernatural or spiritual world of the Blackfeet and why this world is such a necessary component of their history?
When I started doing research for Invisible Reality and the writing of it, one of the things I was really interested in doing was pushing back against a couple of historic narratives in history. One was that Indigenous people were on kind of survival mode, right? That they were always kind of on the verge of starvation, that they were always on the, kind of verge of, again, kind of this nomadic lifestyle following the bison, and that they really were not agents of their own destiny. So I wanted to kind of push back against that historic narrative. I also wanted to push back against another narrative in environmental history, which is that Indigenous people live in harmony and balance with the natural world. I knew that was not true because of the way I was learning about Blackfeet ethnobotany from my grandmother and my oldest aunt. And I'll explain that in just a minute. I wanted to push back against that narrative of harmony and balance. And I really wanted to question, what was their relationship to the natural world? How did they have relationships with plants, animals, and, as anthropologists say, other than human persons, right? So I wanted to really think about what were those relationships that Native people were having. I also, again, wanted to push back against that other narrative of that Indigenous people were thinking about only sort of political and military and survival as kind of their main motivating factor of the decision making that they made. So again, after working with my grandmother and learning from her different stories about our own personal family history, but also tribal history, I realized that a lot of the decision making that the Blackfeet were making, whether it was political or military, was viewed through the lens of religion. And that religion and their worldview and their cosmology came first. So they never viewed the world the way we project upon them, right? So we project upon them, Native people living on the windblown prairies, right, of what is now Montana and Alberta, barely surviving, etc. Indigenous people at that time, and even into the 20th century, are viewing that there is both kind of a visible world that we live in, but that also there is an invisible world. And the title of my book is Invisible Reality. And that comes from a quote that a priest said in the late 19th century. He was trying to understand the Blackfeet so that he could convert them. And so he tried to understand their religion, their worldview, how were they thinking about the world around them? How were they making decisions? What was impacting their daily lives? And he came to that conclusion that the Blackfeet viewed the world through a lens of religion first, and that they believed that there was and again, his quote, invisible reality, and that invisible reality was more real than the visible. And once the Catholics sort of made that connection, they were able to then connect with the Blackfeet on that level and actually were able to convert a lot of Blackfeet to Catholicism because there are a lot of similarities between the two religious viewpoints. So anyway, the Blackfeet view the world, their cosmology is that there are three separate realms of existence. There is the water world, so things that live in the water, and that includes people, animals, plants, people living in villages, people traveling, horses, bison, the plants that we eat. Tobacco comes from the water world. So the water world is its own separate sort of parallel existence. Then there's what is called the below world, and that is here on Earth. So again, on Earth, we've got people, plants, animals, etc. And then there's the sky world. And in the sky world, we also have the same, people, plants, animals. And within these three different worlds, we have both entities that are considered deities within Blackfeet religion, but then also entities that have supernatural power. And one of the things in the belief system of the Blackfeet is that humans have no supernatural power, but the entire worlds around them of these three worlds are permeated with entities that do have supernatural power. So one of the goals of Blackfeet life was to create relationships or allyships with entities that have more power than they do, that have supernatural power. And so one of the goals throughout their entire life was to acquire relationships, acquire allyships, so that as they lived their life, they would always be able to, again, they didn't have to live, quote unquote, in harmony and balance with nature because they could change the natural world, they could control the natural world, they could manipulate the natural world with their relationship with the supernatural realm. So again, one of the things that we as 21st century people look back on the past and we're like, oh gosh, these, poor native people, living in teepees, the wind is blowing, it's cold, etc. Those people are not viewing their life like that at all. They are looking at the world around them and they say, you know what? I have relationships with 20, 25, 30 or more different supernatural entities. And so because of all of these relationships that I have with the supernatural realm, I, as a human, am a powerful person. I am the agent of my own destiny. And that is a different type of confidence, self-confidence that the Blackfeet had. And it's kind of interesting because it is noted in a lot of early contact reports, right, from traders, from travelers, from missionaries, about how confident the Blackfeet were. And oftentimes this was kind of misinterpreted as kind of egoism, right? That they were confident because they had military ability or they were confident because they had a large nation state. And really that confidence came from their religious viewpoint, which was that they created all of these relationships with the world around them. And again, when they looked out at the natural world, what they were seeing were these three parallel worlds that existed, and they were seeing the world through the belief system that they were surrounded by supernatural entities that they could then tap into so that they could live a good life, which they did, and that they could live a healthy life, that they could live a life with abundance, that they could live a life of leisure. So that was sort of their philosophy, and that was how they were able to live for thousands of years on the Northern Great Plains and be, again, a successful and thriving communities.
You mentioned briefly that the Blackfeet interacted with French priests and traders. And Lydia has a question about the Blackfeet's early encounters with Europeans, which is what I'd like for us to explore just after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. This episode is brought to you by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of award-winning books since 1943. In his celebrated account of the origins of American unity, John Adams described July 1776 as the moment when 13 clocks struck at the same time. But once these clocks struck, how did the American colonies overcome long odds to create a durable union capable of declaring and keeping independence from Great Britain? In a powerful new history of the 15 tense months that culminated in the Declaration of Independence, historian Robert Parkinson provides a troubling answer: racial fear. In his new book, 13 Clocks, Parkinson traces the circulation of information in the colonial news systems that linked patriot leaders with average colonists. Parkinson reveals how participants in these news systems constructed a compelling drama featuring virtuous men who suddenly found themselves threatened by ruthless Indians and defiant slaves, all acting on behalf of the king. 13 Clocks was published by the Omohundro Institute and their publishing partner, the University of North Carolina Press. And 13 Clocks is available now in paperback for the low price of $20. If you want to read what one scholar calls the most original work on 1776 in a generation, then check out 13 Clocks by Robert Parkinson, available now in paperback for $20. You can purchase your copy of 13 Clocks by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/clocks. That's benfranklinsworld.com/clocks. Rosalyn, Lydia wonders about the Blackfeet's early encounters with Europeans. Could you tell us about when the Blackfeet met Europeans and Euro-Americans, and how the Blackfeet adapted to having these new peoples on or near their homelands?
I will try to answer that question. So I will just begin by saying, really my sort of expertise in Blackfeet history really is kind of the late 19th century, early 20th century, when the Blackfeet were moving on to the Blackfeet Reservation and that whole transition from living the life that they had previously on the Northern Great Plains to that transition to living a sedentary life, staying in one place pretty much year round on the reservation, and kind of that transition. And I know that there's other historians such as Ted Benema, who has done some really excellent research on the Blackfeet during the kind of 16th through the 18th centuries on the Northern Great Plains. And one of the things that he has written about and done really good research on is the relationship between the Blackfeet and not just kind of the European, both settlers and colonists who were coming in first, but he also has written about the relationships that the Blackfeet had with other tribes. Oftentimes, when the Blackfeet first encountered a European group, it was not through that European group itself, but oftentimes it was through another tribe serving as an emissary to that European group, if that makes sense. And so oftentimes their relationships with whether it was France or the British or the Americans, that those relationships oftentimes were mediated by other tribes as well. So when you think about, what was the relationship between, like, say, the Blackfeet and the French, it was not just the Blackfeet, but it was the Blackfeet, the French, other tribes that were working with the French, the British, and it becomes really kind of almost like a United Nations, right, of groups of people who are creating relationships with each other. And again, back to what I believe is central to the story is religion, right? So the Blackfeet are viewing not only themselves, but they're also viewing the other human communities through this religious lens. So when they are looking at themselves and the relationships that they have created with the supernatural realm, they're also looking at other people and saying, well, what is their relationship to the supernatural realm? What connections do they have? What powers are they bringing to this relationship? So the Blackfeet never thought of these connections with other countries or other tribes as human to human, if that makes sense. They always thought of it as human with supernatural allies to other humans who also have supernatural allies. So when they were, for example, interacting with the French and French traders, they were primarily Catholic, and the Catholics brought with them their own belief system and their own relationship to the supernatural realm, right? Their own Holy Trinity and their own belief that God was on their side. So all of these sort of connections that were happening, I would argue, through Blackfeet eyes, they were viewing not just human to human, they were viewing human plus supernatural versus human plus supernatural.
Jeremy has a question about diplomacy. You mentioned near the start of our conversation that the Blackfeet Confederacy is really spread out over what is now the United States and Canada. And in the early American period, there were several European powers who vied for control of North America that the Blackfeet simply would have had to interact with. So Jeremy wonders how the Blackfeet approached and perhaps approach diplomacy with different tribes, empires, and nation states.
So yeah, I think the word that's important there is diplomacy. I mean, I think there was definitely diplomatic relations during early contact times, really into the 20th century. And the Blackfeet did have, again, kind of a structured society where there were political leaders, there were military leaders, there were religious leaders, civic leaders. So when they did go and speak to other tribes, speak to other nation states, they did have people whose job, so to speak, it was to be a diplomat on behalf of the Blackfeet and the Blackfoot Confederacy and with these other groups. And so they always thought of these relationships kind of as a government to government or nation state to nation state relationship. I mean, it has been documented in other people's works about how, especially kind of the early trading time period, of how elaborate these kind of conversations would happen, right? Where people, they would actually set aside several days just to sit down and have those first moments of saying hello to each other and communicating with each other and talking about what they were going to talk about, right? We still do that today. You see at the United Nations, they have meetings about meetings that are going to happen. And that happened in the past as well. So the idea of diplomacy was something that was very much a part of Indigenous society and something that Europeans who were coming over recognized very quickly that they would have to sit down for several days to kind of hash out the welcomes and the who is who and okay, we're going to have a meeting. Let's meet about what we're going to meet about. Okay, now we've set the ground rules. Here's the protocol. Okay, now we can talk. That was something that was very much a part of Indigenous society and something that, again, kind of the early contact period that people recognized that they would have to do, not just with the Blackfeet, but with other tribes as well.
Now, in addition to being an environmental historian, ethnobotanist, and activist, you're also a linguist. You've written 2 Blackfeet lexicons about the plants that the Blackfeet used and use, and another that provides a vocabulary for different material objects. Rosalyn, would you tell us a bit about the Blackfeet language and about your work to preserve and further the spread of Indigenous languages?
Well, I think Indigenous languages, not just the Blackfeet, but I think all Indigenous languages are extremely important for the study of history and extremely important for historians and scholars and extremely important just for the layperson. If you want to understand the history of the past, I think it's important to be able to know the languages of the people, the languages that were spoken in the past and today. I also think that embedded in language, not just Indigenous language, kind of any language, is, again, that worldview of those people, but also for Indigenous people, the traditional ecological knowledge of those people is embedded in the language. Their religion and religious practice is embedded in the language. The way they related to places is embedded in the language. So it's important for us to return to preserving Indigenous languages and making them not just kind of a relic of the past, but something that are living languages today within communities. One of the things I've done for the past, 20, 25 plus years is worked both at the local level to return children to speaking the language, because there was a long history of colonization within Blackfeet society by both the Americans and the Catholic Church working on behalf of the American government to first, the Blackfeet language was made illegal to use. There was a strong effort within the school systems and in the political structure of the US government to only use the English language and not to speak Blackfeet. Children were taught in English. And so there really was a concerted effort by the US government. A lot of money was spent to try to erase the Blackfeet language, as well as other Indigenous languages. And there were other people kind of complicit in doing this as well, including on our reservation, the Catholic Church and the Methodist Church as well. But I think that languages are extremely important for the reasons that I mentioned. And I think people who are interested in history and in the history of Indigenous people or the history of the Americas, language is key to our understanding of the past. And by continuing to document kind of the past of languages and to continue them as living languages are both really important things to pursue.
What is the process that you and other linguists have gone through in order to recover Indigenous languages? You've written 2 Blackfeet lexicons. What was your process to research and find out the original names for objects and plants in the Blackfeet language?
In terms of documenting and creating things such as lexicons, I am not a trained linguist. I am an environmental historian. I have an undergraduate degree in physics, so I'm not an anthropologist. I'm beginning to sound like a commercial, but I have worked with anthropologists and I've worked with linguists. So what linguists do is something very different than what people in the community do in terms of documenting. I worked on a lexicon with the National Museum of Natural History several years ago. And what they were interested in was they were interested in the material objects that they had at the museum. And they were beginning to recognize that they had a lot of objects that were Blackfeet objects, but also, again, other tribes. And that even though they had these objects, they were using English to describe what these objects were. So, for example, a moccasin, right? The moccasin had, a string that ties the moccasin on. So they were calling that, right, a shoestring, the sole of a moccasin, etc. And so one of the things they were interested in was like, wait, to be scholars, we need to know what these are in the actual language of the people themselves. And so we made a list of some of the objects that were at the National Museum of Natural History, which is part of the Smithsonian. And then we went into the community and I worked with a couple of elders in the Blackfeet community, both in Canada and in the United States. I also worked with first language speakers. I am not a first language speaker. And we started with a list, which a lexicon is just a list of words. And we made a list of material objects. And we then also went to old dictionaries. So dictionaries that were created from 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century by early ethnographers. And what were the words that were in those? And so between working with a first language speaker, working with elders who are also first language speakers, looking at those early dictionaries, we built a lexicon of, I think it's about 450 words of words that describe just objects. Again, from things like blankets, cups, spoons, table, clothing, shirts, moccasins, etc. And the reason, again, that the museum was interested in this was for scholars and scholarship, that they were using the correct words and the correct language when describing the objects that they had in the museum. Of course, the lexicon is of benefit to the Blackfeet as well, because we were able to document all of these words that were used and continue to be used for specific objects that are part of Blackfeet life.
We've really had a good overview of the Blackfeet people. I mean, we've had a really wide-ranging conversation and exploration of Blackfeet history and culture during the early American period. Is there anything else you'd like us to understand about the history of the Blackfeet that we just haven't had a chance to talk about in our conversation?
Well, I guess it should probably should be obvious. I mean, the Blackfeet are still here and are still within our original territory, unlike other tribes in North America that may have been moved, relocated, pushed out of their traditional territories. We are still within our own traditional territory. We have 3 reserves in Canada, 1 reservation in the United States, and the communities are still very much thriving. There are people like myself, I'm not so young anymore, but I used to be young, who grew up in the community, grew up with elders who were very knowledgeable about our history, about our traditional ecological knowledge, about our ethnobotany. People continue to pass down that knowledge. In my case, again, I learned ethnobotany from my grandmother and my oldest aunt. And there are some people like me who are beginning to become scholars, who are beginning to work at the academy, who are writing books and other things about the knowledge of our own history. One of the reasons I kind of decided to do what I was doing is I was working in native language revitalization for many years on the reservation. And the elders I was working with really encouraged me to go back to school and get a PhD and really further my education. But the other thing they encouraged me to do was write about us, to write about our own people, to write about our own history, to write about our own stories. And even though the Blackfeet have been written about a lot by a lot of people for, over 100 plus years, the majority of what's been written about us has been from people outside of our community, people who are not Blackfeet. And so one of the things I was really encouraged to do by the elders I was working with was to tell our own stories and to tell it from our perspective and to tell it from our own communities. So that's something I've tried to do. Again, Blackfeet are still here, very much alive, very much a part of, both American and Canadian society, but very much also now, several of us are really highly educated and writing about our own histories, writing about our own communities. And I think this is something that the listeners should tap into, is read some of the stuff I've written, read, Eldon Yellowhorn. He's an anthropologist / archaeologist in Canada. He's written some really interesting stuff and done some interesting research. And there are several other Blackfeet historians, anthropologists, archaeologists now who are doing some really great work that are telling our own story from our own perspective.
Now we should head into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Rosalyn, in your opinion, what might the history of the Blackfeet people look like if the United States and Canada had not emerged as independent nations?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm going to answer that in 2 different ways. So on the one hand, I think that as a nation state, the Blackfeet would continue to exist. The Blackfeet still exist as nation states. The Blackfeet still have government-to-government relationships, both with the United States and the Canadian government. There are many Blackfeet who push back against the idea that we are colonized. They really do push back against the idea and put forward the idea that we are still our own kind of nation state existing within this colonial structure that we have right now by 2 very large countries. Okay, but what if those 2 large countries did not exist? I would argue that this whole area of North America would be very much like the way Europe or even Africa is. Africa is many different countries, many different tribal communities, many different colonizing powers. Europe is also many different small countries. I think that North America potentially could have also been something similar, where there would have been many different smaller countries, many of them indigenous, but many also colonized and run by a colonizer, very much the way we see Africa is today. I could see that as one potential past future, right? If the United States was not a large entity. The other part of that is I think that one of the big impacts, and you have had people on in the past with this show that have talked about this, is, really the impact of disease on North America, Native North America. And so that is a whole nother story, a whole nother impact that cannot be taken lightly. And the impact of disease on Indigenous people is wider, more pernicious, huger impact than political or military ever was. So we can imagine a future where political and military powers, nation states exist in one way, but the wrench being thrown into that whole kind of imagined future is the impact of disease.
Are you researching and writing a new history book, or what are you working on now, Rosalyn?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm working on right now, and it did grow out of the book Invisible Reality, one of the things I really did not address in that book, because I was really focused more on talking about the role of religion and seeing the world through a religious lens that the Blackfeet had, especially as they transitioned from their lifestyle on the Northern Great Plains to kind of the sedentary reservation lifestyle, was really thinking about the role of gender. So in the next work I'm working on a series of essays on the role of women within Blackfeet society. So I am looking at some of the new archaeological research that is being done by actually young women who are looking back at the past and looking at the stories of Indigenous women in the past differently. So looking at gender from sort of pre-contact times, through the 18th and 19th century, all the way to the 21st century. And one of the things that I really want to talk about is really the impact of the Catholic Church and the US government, in addition to changing the languages that Indigenous people spoke. There was really a concerted effort to change gender and gender roles and gender identity within Blackfeet society and within Indigenous communities, and to introduce the Western idea of a binary between men and women. And that was new to the Blackfeet. It's a new idea, a new concept, and something that had long-ranging impact into the 21st century. So just that idea of gender roles, gender identity, with a focus on women and the lives of women in Blackfeet history is what I'm working on right now and really excited about.
I know our conversation has piqued our interests in Blackfeet history. Is there a good place where we can go to learn more about the Blackfeet, and perhaps a good place where we can reach you if we have more questions?
Well, people can always look at my website. I have two websites. One is my personal website, which is just rosalynlapier.com. Then also my university website. And on those websites, I share a lot of the writing that I have done on Blackfeet history. But then also I write on environmental activism within Indigenous communities worldwide. I think that those are a good place to start. But I think there's also a lot of Blackfeet writers and thinkers out there. And one of the places I'll just give a plug for is when you're buying books, one place to go to is Birch Bark Books in Minneapolis, which is owned by Louise Erdrich. She does stock some amazing kind of Indigenous histories, and she does try to focus on, Indigenous stories told by Indigenous people. So if you're just wondering, what's out there, it's a great place to go and look for what that latest literature is out there from Native or Indigenous perspective.
Rosalyn LaPier, thank you for joining us and for introducing us to the Blackfeet people and for all your help in helping us better understand some of their early American history.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
The Blackfeet people are one of the many Indigenous groups and nations who lived in North America during the early American period and who continue to live in North America today. As Rosalyn described, by the early American period that we study, the Blackfeet had built an empire in the heart of the North American continent. This empire consisted of 4 Blackfeet tribes and about 100 villages, spread out over an area that extended from what is now the Saskatchewan River in the middle of Alberta, south to the Yellowstone River in Montana, and from the Rocky Mountains to the middle of the prairies, where the Yellowstone River meets the Missouri River. The Blackfeet used their homelands purposefully and intentionally. For 6 months of the year, they camped near rivers to weather the biting winters of the North American interior and to prepare for the better weather of spring and summer, when they would hunt and gather during their seasonal rounds. During the early American period, the Blackfeet lived a semi-sedentary life. But this semi-sedentary life shouldn't be viewed as an aimless nomadic lifestyle. During warmer months, the Blackfeet purposefully visited up to 15 different locations, where they knew specific plants for food, medicine, and tools awaited them, and to locations where they knew the bison would pass through. Each stop the Blackfeet made on their seasonal rounds was purposeful, because the Blackfeet knew that each stop would help them gather what they needed to live and thrive in the present and during the coming winter months. Likewise, the Blackfeet also conducted their diplomacy with purpose. As Rosalyn described, the Blackfeet were seen by others as a confident people during the early American period, and they derived much of their confidence from their views and understandings of the supernatural and spiritual worlds. Just as they forged relationships and diplomatic understandings with other Native American peoples and with European and Euro-American settlers, the Blackfeet also forged relationships with supernatural beings who had supernatural power. The Blackfeet stand as one of the many indigenous peoples who lived and thrived on the North American continent for centuries before and centuries after the arrival of Europeans and enslaved Africans. Taking the time to learn about their histories helps us better understand the early American past and the many different peoples who lived and interacted with each other between 1450 and 1820. And as a final note, please remember that the Blackfeet and many other indigenous peoples who lived, thrived, and were tried during the early American period are still living with us today. They adapted and persisted despite some very trying times, to say the least, and they are still among the groups of different peoples who live and interact in the North American continent today. You'll find more information about Rosalyn, her work, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/310. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolfe. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, there are so many fascinating Indigenous peoples and societies to explore. So I wonder, which Indigenous societies would you like to explore next? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.